Welcome back to my humble abode. Feel free to take a look around.
Alright, this will require more exploration of the topic, so the review won't be as quick as I usually try to keep them. I used to love Tomb Raider. I mentioned that several years ago in the video on Rise of the Tomb Raider that I didn't like that much, and it sucked to have only that one negative video on a series you admire. So when I revisited the Legend timeline 3 years ago, I planned to finally make a very positive big video about revisiting the period of Tomb Raider I considered the most consistently good. But I was very busy with work tasks at the time, so it constantly got postponed. Until when I finally had some time and decided to do so about half a year later, Russia invaded, and now I had additional stress to manage. Couple years of work, survival balance management later, I've realized that I won't be able to handle that video anymore to the quality I wanted, without replaying the games again, something that I wasn't quite ready to do. So I've collected all of the material I recorded into one video and posted it a few months ago. I'll link that in the description too, in case you're interested in remembering how those wonderful games looked like. But now, the Tomb Raider 1 through 3 Remastered collection, starring Lara Croft, forgot that part. Anyway, now that it's out, I couldn't not make a video on it. After all, in my criticisms of Rise of the Tomb Raider, I pointed out how classic titles had a really smart systemic approach to platforming that felt meaningful. Before I begin with the review proper though, I need to establish a few important things. For one, my favorite classic title is The Last Revelation, that is not included in this collection. Second is that this is less of a revisit and more of a fresh playthrough. This was the first time I've completed Tomb Raider 1, 2 and all the previously PC exclusive expansions. I don't remember the reason why I haven't finished the first game originally, but it was most likely due to some PC hardware issues. The second game I straight up gave up on because it got really frustrating to play, and while I have completed the third game 2 decades ago or so, I barely remembered anything about it. And finally, I won't be going too deep into each game and expansion here, and we'll look at the collection as a whole, with the games being an important element of it. As usual, I do go deeper in my text review that is also linked in the description. This collection is a wonderful way to experience the first 3 Tomb Raider titles. Every game keeps its original identity and look if you're using the original visuals, while also getting a lot of fantastic quality of life improvements, weapon shortcuts for keyboard and controller, minor but meaningful improvements for how Lara's moves work to make them unified across all 3 games, while still keeping complete game changers unique to each title. There's a new visual look you can toggle with the press of a button that can look wonderful and detailed without negatively impacting the readability of locations. Modern camera relative controls, for those who think they can handle them in a game designed around tank controls, are also present. Even some of the originally cut elements are reintroduced here and there, like the crouch roll and one music track in the third game. But the collection wouldn't be good if the games weren't worth playing. The original Tomb Raider is still really good, even with the existence of Tomb Raider Anniversary Remake. And while I have issues with the rest of the games in the collection, at their best, they're unlike anything that's made today. Just like in the original Prince of Persia games, platforming is exhilarating as any mistake can lead to death, and the process of looking at the location to identify your potential path through the obstacle course prepared by the developers remains exciting throughout. Plus, despite many criticisms I can give to the sequels, they also bring some very impressive and inventive ideas that spice up the basic gameplay in interesting ways. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fantastic soundtracks. While most of the time your exploration is accompanied only by moody ambience and the sounds of Lara's grunts and guns, when music starts playing, it's always wonderful. Oh, and while for some the original visuals might look dated and odd, I found them still wonderful, and in case of the third game and its expansion, I straight up prefer the high contrast colorful look that the original visuals have. There are some extremely strange omissions though. For example, no manual is included in or outside of the game, which means that a lot of the moves and interactions, especially for the vehicles, are unexplained and you have to figure them out for yourself. Same goes for the stories for expansions that were originally told in manual and on the box art. And some decisions for the collection are bizarre. There are hundreds of achievements, with some of them requiring the players to play the game incorrectly, and there is also a New Game Plus option that feels unnecessary. All weapons from the start isn't a change that enhances a playthrough, while the return of limited saving for the first and the third game it introduces, like it used to be in the PlayStation versions, is just a downgrade, and I would not recommend anyone play the game that way. Some things are straight up bad though. There are no visual settings of any kind, so the collection selects the resolution and refresh rate on its own, with no option to affect it. No brightness controls either, which is a problem for the second and third games as they get really dark, and you don't always have access to flares in such moments. The sound mixing in the third game is much quieter for some reason, and I often had Lara ignore some of the inputs for jumps or walking when I was pressing two buttons at the same time, which never happened to me on PlayStation, both real hardware or on emulation. Despite being the big positive, games themselves become a big part of the negative. Tomb Raider 2 gets quite frustrating by the end. Tomb Raider 3, with its ambitions to be non-linear and super dense, is often confusing and unclear. Golden Mask and Lost Artifact, while really cool, suffer from much the same issues as the games they were added to, and the less is said about unfinished business, the better. Even the original game becomes somewhat confusing by the end, it just mercifully finishes before things get too bad. Aspyr also made some questionable business decisions for this collection. A lot of Russian tax-paying citizens were involved in making this collection, and one would assume they got paid, which is already an issue given that Russia spends its tax money on killing Ukrainians and Syrians. But on top of just having Saber Interactive, which by the way are a Russian-based company if you didn't know, and people responsible for engine ports, Aspyr decided to add full Russian voice acting to the game specifically for this collection, and then let a Russian translator make a Ukrainian localization of the game that is unusable. We can argue if the last point was an intentional sabotage or just laziness, but the point remains, and I hope that the inevitable remaster of the rest of the classic Tomb Raider titles can be made without potentially financing war crimes. Though, even without that, I've noticed some bizarre things in the updated visuals. Big example would be this portrait of Cain from Legacy of Kain, something that Crystal Dynamics added in Legend as an Easter egg, and also something that should probably not be in the collection of games made by Core Design, given that Crystal Dynamics had nothing to do with both the original titles or this remaster. But I've been talking especially long this time. Well, the conclusion is very simple. Despite weird and questionable choices and important omissions, Tomb Raider 1 through 3 Remastered is a wonderful collection that might remind people why Tomb Raider was so important in shaping 3D action adventures of today. I hope it will also inspire people to invent new ways of bringing back meaningful platforming, even if it doesn't have to stick to the style-based systemic approach. And I also hope that The Last Revelation and Chronicles are also getting a remaster, as the fourth game, in my opinion, is where the classic Tomb Raider reached its peak.
Don't you think you've seen enough?